Hello and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Lee, and I'm speaking with Matthew Briones, Associate Professor of American History and the College from the Department of History. His research focuses include the history of Asians in America, interracial relationships, African American history, and the history of race, sports, and politics. He is also a faculty affiliate for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Professor Briones is here to talk to us about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Briones. It's great to have you.
Oh, thanks, Lee. Really appreciate being here.
So, Matt, just to start out, can you give me a general overview of your career path from your college years to your position today as a professor at UChicago?
Sure. I grew up in Boston, and my dad and mom came over here from the Philippines in 1968. And so, but I thought I was going to follow in his footsteps and become a doctor, et cetera. But once I got to Harvard and did very poorly in bio and chem, I recognized, pre-med's not going to happen. I just wasn't serious enough in college to do much of anything, to be honest with you, but certainly not pre-med. And when I graduated, I was an English major, really interested in AFAM literature, African American literature. I went on and taught English at it was a private school for boys called Belmont Hill. But I taught there for 4 years and I loved it. I was a coach, soccer, basketball, and track, and lived on the campus and really just thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. But one summer I was lucky enough to go up to Middlebury, Vermont. They have something called Breadloaf School of English, and took a course with Robert Steptoe of Yale, and just kind of fell in love with the idea of maybe teaching college. And the following year kind of went off to applied to a couple of PhD programs and only got into a couple of them, but Harvard was one of them, and kind of made the switch from just English to looking at both history and literature, and was in an American Studies program. It was called History of American Civilization at the time, and now it's an American Studies program. And my mentor in college, Werner Solers, he is a great literary scholar. He's an emeritus now. Sort of invited me back, and I worked with him and Cornel West and Akira Irie, just a number of really interesting different kinds of folks from different backgrounds, history, philosophy, literary scholars, and just went with what I really thought I'd love, which was studying sort of the interaction between African Americans and Asian Americans, and wrote a dissertation about a really interesting guy who wrote in his diary for 47 straight years, was incarcerated during the Second World War because of being Japanese American, and looked at how he interacted with other racialized groups during the incarceration, but also particularly after the war, and just what that experience meant for him, and how he viewed civil rights and sort of viewed other racialized groups' struggle in the post-war. So with a postdoc fellowship, a Mellon postdoc, and parlayed that into a tenure-track job. And it was an American culture program at Michigan, worked with a great mentor, a great Native American scholar, Phil Deloria. And he guided me for the next 4 years until sort of family considerations forced me to apply for a new job, and came down here to the University of Chicago in 2009. And I've been here ever since, and it's been up and down. It's like anything, anybody's life. You have your ups and downs, so the personal will sometimes affect the professional. But I've really grown to love the place. The students are excellent. I've taught at Harvard, Michigan, Princeton, Columbia, and these are the best students I've taught. Maybe next to Princeton students, but they take it seriously. My predecessor was May Nye, the great immigration historian, now at Columbia. So they were big shoes to fill, but I've really enjoyed my time here ever since.
So, Matt, I'm curious how you would explain your research to someone who has no idea what it is, no experience with it.
Sure. I'm interested in the possibilities of, in a very broad sense, how do people get along, and how they can get along, and particularly across racialized or even socioeconomic lines, gendered lines, et cetera. How do you build interracial coalitions, or just coalitions moving forward? And they can fail, they can succeed, but even if they fail, are there moments where you could see the possibility that something could be a promising relationship? Back in 1955, Yale historian C. Van Woodward, wrote this great book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And it was timely because it was trying to also prove to people who were wrestling with Brown v. Board of Education and the idea of integrating schools and black and white kids. The idea, he writes about the South and says, actually, the immutable history of the South, it's not immutable. There was a time at which black and white people were able to live together, integrated in the South. And so if that is a possibility that took place before Civil War, et cetera, then that can return and sort of trying to understand the possibility of integration and interracial alliances. So I sort of follow that blueprint, the idea that, oh boy, in 1992 you have these LA riots or the uprising, and you see African Americans in turmoil with Korean Americans, for example. These two groups can never get along. But I think if you go back in the history and you try to understand, look, these groups have interacted before, and there have been moments of great alliance historically, and particularly during a flashpoint like the Japanese American incarceration, seeing someone like W.E.B. Du Bois standing up when no one else would, and in fighting for Japanese American civil rights and calling out the government for its error, and then increasingly seeing more and more other sort of racialized and interracial groups rallying to Japanese American causes, shows you the possibility of what can be done politically, what kind of coalitions can be built to sort of advance what we think of as this real democratic experience. Hopefully that would give them a sense, how do people get along, and what is the history and what's the possibility of people getting along again, particularly in the middle right now of Black Lives Matter movements, anti-Asian violence and hatred in the United States. Can these two groups form an alliance that also sort of, because there certainly is a lot of anti-Black racism in the Asian American community, or even anti-Asian sentiment in the African American community. But as we know, these are they're not monolithic groups. And so I see more overlap and interaction in a positive sense. And so that's what I'm trying to understand. What did I learn? What can I tell you about the past in terms of relationships between racialized groups that might help us in our present and in our future?
Thank you for that explanation, Matt. And I know you said that in college, you realized that you didn't want to be a physician. You didn't want to go the medical route, and that you weren't necessarily the most serious student. What were you like in middle and high school? Who were you as a student and as a person?
Yeah, that's when I was really serious. I had the unfortunate and maybe unique experience that my parents left me at a pretty young age. They left me with my oldest brother in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts when I was 9. And I kept on going to a school called the Dexter School. It was for all boys, and JFK had gone there, and George Bundy, and all of these, Brahmins from Boston. But I went from 4th grade to 8th grade there and just studied my butt off and worked really hard, missed my parents, didn't understand why they were gone, to be honest with you. And then headed off to boarding school in Western Massachusetts, a place called Deerfield Academy, where my two brothers had gone as well. Was really homesick, was really depressed, but my emotional development wasn't to a point that I could really understand what was going on. I think if I did, it really could have destroyed me. So what I ended up doing was really putting a lot of those, anxieties and feelings into working really hard, academically, athletically, extracurricularly, et cetera. And, ever since I was 9, I always had the idea, I'm going to Harvard. I'm going to Harvard. I'm going to work so hard that I'm going to go to Harvard. And sure enough, I did that. I was a 17, 18-year-old. But once I got to Harvard, I recognized, my God, this is not the end all be all. This isn't going to make me completely happy emotionally. And I really struggled just in sort of growing up and becoming a young man. I didn't have enough modeling from parents, and my brothers were too young. They were only 6 years older and 8 years older to really help me deal with a lot of, emotion, sadness, anger, et cetera, depression that I really experienced during my college years. So it was tough. And Harvard then was kind of a mixed experience for me. I loved it in some ways, hated it in others. And then I returned 4 years later. So I spent 11 years of my first 33 years at Harvard, and it was really, I didn't know any better. I was a really small, in a lot of ways, very parochial and very small-minded and not emotionally developed. And I do think a lot of kids like that go to these elite institutions in America, right? But I also think that's why we're starting to see spikes in suicides in these places, a lot of suicidal ideation and depression, and it's not healthy, And so I make a point of telling my students, every quarter how important it is for them to seek help, and to seek out therapy or at least seek out professional services. Just knowing what they're going through, and maybe some of them don't want to admit it and can't put, words, can't describe it or are afraid to share it with friends. But I think if I share my own experience and say how depressed I was going through Harvard, then at least I think they can see, whoa, okay, this guy's all right. He's made it, but it sounds like he had a lot of struggles and failures. Maybe I can, admit to that as well. So, yeah, I feel like that's part of my job now, right, in teaching. It's not just the academics. It's not just the scholarship that I'm writing. It really is to kind of, mentor and tend to these young people who are struggling. And particularly after COVID, their socialization skills aren't the best, and they're not the best at expressing their real feelings and admitting it. So I think this is our responsibility. A lot of my responsibility as a higher education teacher and my colleagues, is to really look out for these kids.
I appreciate that reflection. And I wonder if looking back on that period of time during your high school years, that there's any memories or any insight into who you were then that really explain how you became the person that you are today and why you have these particular research interests.
It's a great question. I was looking for family, to be honest with you. When you're abandoned at 9, and my oldest brother tried his best to bring me up, but he was a freshman in college. There was only so much he could do. So I got to boarding school and really thought of trying to seek out a surrogate family, whether that meant great teachers I had who really mentored me, or coaches and friends, and it tended to be a pretty multiracial group, to be honest. We weren't the group of kids who came from a lot of money and were third or fourth generation preppies. We were Black kids, yellow kids, poor white kids from California. And my need to have a kind of surrogate family, I think, really affected the way in which I saw myself over time, and college was like that too, kind of trying to seek out a niche and your group of friends and a surrogate family. But it's really evident when you read my book that, Charlie Kikuchi, the guy I write about, was orphaned at a young age. He reconnected with his family during incarceration, but he was already an older man by then. Not an older man, but not a young man anymore. And you just see him sort of growing up in this multiracial orphanage. And so, I write a history of his family and of his quest to sort of find not only, his own Kikuchi family, but really to find his place within the American family, and how Japanese Americans were really trying to seek a seat at the table, of American democracy. And so there are parallels there that I didn't really know it in the time that I was writing my dissertation, but I remember my daughter, she was reading the preface to my book, and she was only in high school, and she just said, "Yeah, this book's totally about you, isn't it, Dad?" So it's kind of funny the way these things, as you say, it was something that was probably formed even before high school, the idea of how do you search for family, and then how do you belong, and I think that completely affects how I look at the world and how I study what I study. How do these Filipinos, Native Americans, African Americans, how do they find themselves, within the American family? What about those ethnic white groups that weren't completely white, the Irish and the Italians and Slavs and Jews, how did they get to a point where they were accepted, or have they been, so it really is thinking a lot about belonging and, again, the potential to be part of this democratic family.
So understanding, how you became interested in those particular subjects, why did you want to become a professor? What was appealing to you about spending your life in academia?
I think I was pretty jaded about it. I think going through the first few years of the PhD process were really disheartening, because what ends up happening is you have a lot of young, insecure folks who are very bright, intellectually jousting, in these small little classrooms in Cambridge. And it's, forgive me for using the phrase, but, it's a pissing contest. A lot of people are really trying to impress the professor, put you down, et cetera. So I think initially I was thinking, man, this is not really the kind of beloved community I want to be a part of. And even when I became a tenure track professor, it was really hard here at U of C for a little while to feel like, wow, I really want to do this long term. Gaining tenure, achieving tenure is a hard thing. You're trying to, write a book, transform your dissertation into a book, but you're juggling a heck of a lot in your personal life too. I had 2 young daughters that were 4 years apart, so you can only imagine 2 young kids under 5. Struggling with an ex-wife who was also struggling with her own professional career as a physician, and I really didn't know I wanted to stay with it. I wanted to become a writer. I want to write the great American novel, So I'll just say it's a mixed bag, and I think it's a lot of good luck. I did end up getting tenure kind of a little bit early and became much more comfortable with my colleagues here, Tom Holt, Leora Auslander, Adam Green, just really good friends who were looking out for me. And I felt like they really got to know me, not just sort of the academic. And I've sort of ever since then, I've kind of recognized, my God, how lucky are you? You get to teach at a top 10 university in the world, and these great students, you get time off and you get paid to do this. This is crazy. So, the first world problems sort of go by the wayside, and I experienced a very bad divorce. So, just being able to spend time with my daughters, who are now 18 and 14, that's just the world to me, So being able to be a professor who has a little bit of extra time to be able to spend time with his kids, something that I didn't get as a kid, means the world to me. And I still think you can bring that kind of attitude to your classroom, to be honest with you, and to your scholarship. I think one of the questions you'd ask, is what kind of sustains you, or, what are the highlights? It's always the students. It's always, being around these young people and hearing what they think and constantly feeling rejuvenated year to year, and not getting jaded about it yet. And I've been teaching since 1995. So I get nervous every fall, and I just feel like, boy, that must mean that I really care about this. Until I don't feel nervous, I think I'll keep doing it.
Who did you lean on for support? Who was there for you?
Professionally, the mentors were unparalleled. I talked about Werner Solers. He's a great German-American scholar who has written countless books about African-American literature and interracialism. And Cornel West really was a huge rock throughout a lot of my life, particularly my mom passed away in 2008, and throughout the months leading up to her death, I would hear from him every day, and he would just check in and see how I was doing. And he knew I wasn't religious, even though he himself is a lay Christian minister. So it wasn't ever talking about God or anything like that. It was just making sure I was okay. He means the world to me. And then in Michigan, I mentioned before, the Native American scholar Phil Delory just looked out for me, and is just one of the good people in this line of work. Earnest, thoughtful, brilliant. He's moved on to Harvard now, but just the kindness that he showed me. So professionally, I would say at the very least, there are those 3. Back to back in my personal life, it really is my wife Joanna now, and my 2 daughters. Kate and Samela. They saw their dad cry a lot. They leaned on me as much as I leaned on them, and that's what's sort of been. They've been my rock. And not to mention a lot of therapy. You got to get a lot of good therapy in there. So I've been able to rely on a great therapist as well.
So you mentioned the sense of nervousness that you have, and that as long as you have that, you want to continue to do this work. But I also wonder if you have any aspirations, and who or what continues to inspire you to do more, to push yourself outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things I learned from Cornel West was part of our job here is to unhouse, and to discomfort you, to a certain degree, not to feel uncomfortable in class or, triggered in that sense, but to feel intellectually unhoused, to see things from a different angle that you had never thought of before. And likewise, not only to try to encourage your students to think that way, but to learn from them, and to really, there isn't a year that goes by that doesn't go by. I guess that would be the right way to say it. That, I don't say to students, wow, I never thought about it in that way. I'm still constantly learning. I think a lot of my teachers, but really Cornell has always influenced me, and I do feel like there's a lot you can do in the classroom, and I will never be a great activist, scholar activist, or public intellectual the way some of my colleagues are, or the way that Cornell is. To really come back to an idea of carrying on his tradition of sort of asking ourselves, what does it mean to be, he says, American, Democrat, small d, and a human, those three pillars, and how if people like James Baldwin or Toni Morrison or name the African-American intellectual Du Bois, or, how do they constantly kind of go to the well and try to help their readers and interlocutors understand what does it mean to be, an American? What does it mean to be a Democrat? What does it mean to be a human in this particular moment? And my God, in this particular moment with everything that's, everything we believe in, in democratic pillars, I know from history that it has never been this, a secure bulwark. It's not American exceptionalism, but this is really quite a moment, quite a crisis in our democracy. So I guess the answer is just to kind of convey that passion for understanding our history, but also understanding the process and our democratic process. Even if kids don't major in history, even if they're still going to take econ here or biology, at least when they, leave, they'll still think, boy, these are the kinds of questions I want to wrestle with, even if I'm going to be single-minded about, being an investment banker or orthopedist, that they will still come back and think, gosh, I at least learn to understand or think about or question uncomfortably what it means to, to live in this, democracy that's really being challenged.
And Matt, what would your advice be for students, people in general who are considering entering your field?
Tread carefully. I think sadly the university writ large has really gone the corporatist route. That is to say, they're looking at efficiencies. They're getting rid of more tenure track professors or lines, and then they're fattening up the administrative class, so there's so many executive vice presidents of this and that. And then they're sort of, adjunctifying the teaching of college students, and a lot of these folks are people who can't get tenure track jobs. They may not get great benefits, but they're going to be, economically efficient or economically sound. And I don't want my grad students having to face that. My number of grad students has shrunk over the time I've been here. And I think it's because, a lot of young people are recognizing the reality of trying to get a PhD and a tenure track job. That being said, there are a lot of non-academic jobs that PhDs do. And if you're really into the life of the mind and want to get that PhD, just be prepared that, increasingly non-academic jobs are out there, museum work, curation, maybe consulting, public history. There are so many other options, but it's a grind. And if you want to spend 7 years, you really have to love your subject, and you really have to be able to see the long game and be patient and be prepared for a lot of lean years. But, I tell all my students, undergraduates, graduate students, friends, when freshmen come into the University of Chicago, I always tell them, fail to the best of your ability. Try everything. Try courses you've never even thought you would take. And if you fail, that's okay. You pick yourself up, and that's how we keep learning. This is the best way to kind of learn, And so I don't think there's anything wrong with anybody who wants to come into academia and maybe figures out the first couple of years, this isn't for me, and I've had a couple students like that, and they go on to do great things, So failure is not necessarily a bad thing, either in your, professional life or certainly in your personal life, And I think the quest for perfection that so many of our young people, but particularly the students here at the U of C, hold themselves to, that standard, is really obviously unachievable and impossible. But helping to let them see, wow, you can falter, you're going to learn a lot from it, and it might be the best thing that happens to you going forward. So yeah, that would be it's a long-winded answer to what kind of advice I would give.
And then finally, Matt, what is the most gratifying thing about your job?
I still think it's the students. I do have wonderful colleagues, again, whom I rely on and love seeing in the department. Adam Green, Leora Auslander, Tom Holt, who's retired now, Ken Pomerantz, who leads up the Hong Kong Center, Emilio Curie and Brody Fisher, folks who have just been good friends. But it really comes back to the students. They're changing a little bit, I will say. I think the more that U of C competes with the likes of Harvard and Stanford, there are increasingly more kids who check a lot of the boxes. But the odd kid, the awkward kid, the intellectually driven kid whom we still get, that brings me back every single year. As I said earlier, just the youth, their youthfulness and energy, and the way they, engage enthusiastically, that, feeds me so much every year. And it's gratifying, and I always say, if I could affect one kid per year, that would be great. That would be a lifetime of accomplishments. That's my challenge every year, is to can I make a difference in a young person's life, even if it's very infinitesimal? They won't remember the class. They won't remember my name. But maybe they'll remember some kind of idea I brought up or challenged them with, and maybe that's something they think about in 20 years, 25 years. That's fine with me. I don't need the recognition. I just want them to keep thinking. And if I can encourage that, all the compensation I need, really.
I've been speaking with Associate Professor Matthew Briones. Professor, thank you for your time. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Thanks for listening.